Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you to the 10th video in the series on communication, titled Types of Communication, A Different Perspective. I am so excited to guide you through today's explainer, because we're going to completely rethink how information moves between us every single day. I mean, think about it. We spend so much of our waking hours communicating, right? Yet, how often do we actually stop to consider the hidden structures behind our conversations? Today, we're going to uncover exactly that.
I want to start by hooking you with this incredible quote from communication scholars Rogers and Kincaid. Take just a second to read that. Now notice what they don't say. They don't say communication is just talking or sending an email. No, it is a dynamic, active process where participants create and share information to reach mutual understanding. That is the key phrase there, mutual understanding. If we just broadcast words out into the void but no shared meaning is actually created, well, we haven't really communicated. We've literally just made noise. This philosophical idea that true communication actually requires mutual understanding is going to be the critical lens through which we view absolutely everything today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by breaking down the actual process of communication. Then, we're going to explore formal and informal structures, evaluating the famously powerful organizational grapevine along the way. Next up, we'll contrast one-way versus two-way flows of information, and finally, we'll bring the whole shebang together with some real-world communication applications. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The process of communication. Moving beyond simple messages.
To really appreciate the types of communication we use today, we kind of need to take a quick look back at how our understanding has evolved historically. It's actually shifted from a very mechanical process to a deeply human one. So, back in 1949, scholars Shannon and Weaver proposed this famous mathematical model. As you can see, it's very linear. You start with an information source, which uses a transmitter to send a signal through a channel, moving to a receiver, and finally arriving at a destination. Think of like a telegraph or an early telephone line. But notice the ever-present danger of noise in this model. Shannon and Weaver rightly pointed out that as messages move mechanically, they can be disrupted. This could be literal physical noise, like, static on a phone line or a loud truck driving by while you're trying to talk. Or it could be figurative, semantic noise. Imagine a confusingly worded corporate memo that is just so packed with jargon, it leaves the receiver totally baffled. That's noise too.
But let's be real, humans aren't machines, right? Contrast those mechanical steps with Berlow's social process model, which was introduced in 1960. Berlow's source, message, channel, receiver model, often just called the SMCR model, argues that communication deeply depends on human context. It is not just about wires and signals. Every single message is shaped by the sender's and receiver's communication skills, their attitudes, their background knowledge, and the broader social systems and cultures they exist within. It's totally an interpretive process. Imagine trying to explain a really complex joke to someone from a completely different cultural background. The words might mechanically reach their ears perfectly fine, but the social system and context shift the entire meaning. Human context shapes absolutely everything about how a message is received.
Moving on to Section 2, Formal and Informal Structures, the Architecture of Interaction. Now that we know human context matters so much, let's look at the actual environments where these humans interact. We'll start with the big one, formal organizational structures. Formal communication is the official, established way we communicate. Think of official letters, HR policies, legally binding contracts, or those scheduled all-hands meetings. Scholars Katz and Kahn effectively argue that organizations desperately need this type of communication system, and you might be wondering why. Well, because without it, you literally have chaos. When you've got hundreds or even thousands of people trying to achieve a unified goal, organizations have to rely on formal communication to coordinate roles, maintain authority, and support their collective goals. It basically acts as the structural skeleton of the entire company.
So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding how this formal communication actually flows through an organizational hierarchy. Researchers Robbins and Judge note that this coordination happens in multiple very specific directions. Let's really think about these with some real-world examples. First off, there's downward flow. This is, say, a manager issuing instructions to employees, or maybe a principal sending operational directives down to teachers. It clearly establishes authority. Then we have upward flow. This is absolutely vital for feedback, like an employee sending a weekly progress report up the chain to leadership, or a student submitting a formal application. It tells management what's actually happening on the ground. Next up is horizontal flow. This occurs between peers who are at the exact same level. Imagine two teachers of completely different subjects collaborating on a joint curriculum to make sure their classes align. And finally, there's diagonal flow, which cuts right across levels and departments. A great example would be a finance officer contacting a project supervisor directly to clarify a specific budget item, just bypassing the immediate chain of command for the sake of efficiency. All of these flows basically interlock to keep the organizational machinery running smoothly and formally.
However, let's not kid ourselves. Formal systems aren't perfect. Let's break down the pros and cons here. The advantages are huge, for sure. Formal communication is incredibly accurate, highly documented for legal and historical records, authoritative, and it ensures accountability. If something goes wrong, you can just check the paper trail. But take a look at the limitations. It can be painfully slow, bogged down by endless layers of bureaucracy, and terribly rigid. Communication expert Owen Hargy notes that skilled communication actually requires responsiveness. If an organization relies purely on rigid formal systems, it becomes terribly impersonal. It treats people like cogs in a machine and often completely fails to respond to people's actual emotional and practical needs when a fast-moving crisis hits.
Section 3. Evaluating the organizational grapevine. The power of unofficial networks.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Have you ever found out about a major company change or maybe a new school policy, not from an official email, but from a friend whispering in the hallway? Yeah, me too. That is the grapevine in action. We define informal communication as unofficial interaction that happens naturally through personal relationships and just everyday chats. It doesn't follow fixed rules or organizational charts. Way back in 1938, a theorist named Chester Barnard observed something pretty fascinating. Informal organizations exist naturally within formal organizations. Even in the most highly structured military or corporate institutions, these informal networks are vital. People don't just act as job titles, right? They act as humans. These informal networks are absolutely essential for actual day-to-day cooperation and problem solving.
Let's linger on the grapevine's impact for a minute, because it is profound. Informal communication is incredibly fast. It often beats official channels to the punch. It's flexible, it builds morale, and it highly encourages creativity because people can just throw around ideas without the fear of a formal review process. Communication scholar Catherine Miller points out that it actually helps members make sense of organizational life, filling in the gaps left by confusing official messages. When that formal memo doesn't make any sense, people turn to each other to translate it. But we definitely must warn about the dangers here. Because it completely bypasses official fact-checking, it very easily spreads unverified rumors. Think about a false rumor spreading about a really tough upcoming school exam or a workplace panic over non-existent layoffs. That kind of thing can create massive, completely unnecessary anxiety and completely exclude those who just aren't in the specific social loop.
And this brilliantly illustrates our first major comparison of the explainer: formal versus informal. Formal is official, planned, and documented. Informal is unofficial, spontaneous, and deeply personal. The major takeaway here is that a healthy organization desperately needs both. It's not a choice between the two. If you rely only on formal policies, your organization becomes cold and rigid, and totally unable to adapt. But if you rely only on informal chats, well, you descend into disorganized unreliability where literally nothing is documented. You need the solid structure of formal policies beautifully balanced with the vibrant, adaptable human connection of informal relationships.
Section 4. One-way versus two-way flow. The direction of information. All right, now let's pivot to our second major pairing. We are shifting our focus from the structure of the message to its actual direction and feedback loop. One-way communication is exactly what it sounds like. Information flows from the sender to the receiver, full stop. There is no immediate feedback or interaction. Think of this as the megaphone approach. This ties directly back to that linear Shannon and Weaver model we looked at earlier. The sender broadcasts the message out into the world, and the receiver just absorbs it, without any mechanism to instantly reply. Now, the megaphone approach actually has a very specific utility. Its advantages, well, it is extremely efficient. You can reach the masses incredibly quickly without getting bogged down in a million replies. It is absolutely ideal for emergencies. If there's a fire alarm or a severe weather warning, that needs to be a one-way blast to tell you to take cover immediately. You don't debate a fire alarm, right? You just act. However, its limitations are severe. Joseph DeVito explains that effective communication absolutely requires feedback to confirm understanding. With one-way communication, there's zero feedback loop. If the message is highly complex or nuanced, the receiver cannot ask for clarification. That means true understanding might totally fail, and the craziest part is, the sender will have absolutely no idea until it's far too late.
And that is exactly where our next definition comes in: two-way communication. This is an interactive exchange where both parties exchange messages and feedback. We can call this the conversational approach. This heavily leans on Wilbur Schramm's interactive model of communication. In Schramm's model, the receiver is highly active, not passive. The receiver interprets the message, responds, asks questions, and basically becomes the sender in the very next stage of the interaction, creating this continuous, dynamic loop of shared meaning.
Let's look at the pros and cons of the conversational approach. It massively improves understanding and corrects errors immediately, leading directly to that mutual understanding Rogers and Kincaid talked about at the very beginning of our explainer. Because you can adjust your message on the fly based on the other person's reaction, it builds tremendous trust. But it is entirely fair to point out the limitations here. It is highly time-consuming. You simply can't have a deep two-way conversation with 10,000 people all at once. More importantly, it requires real communication skills from all participants. I'm talking patience, active listening, and mutual respect. If people interrupt, refuse to listen, or just let their emotions rule the day, two-way communication can easily degrade into totally unproductive conflict.
To summarize this pairing, one-way flow is incredibly efficient for announcements, while two-way flow is absolutely essential for learning and problem-solving. Think of it this way. A traffic light must be a one-way signal. Drivers need a quick, immediate directive to maintain safety on the road. You don't want a philosophical discussion about whether or not to stop at the intersection. But on the flip side, a teacher explaining a deeply complex mathematical concept to a struggling student, that strictly requires a two-way discussion so the student can ask questions, work through their confusion, and clarify their doubts. Choosing the right flow for the right moment really is a communication superpower.
And finally, Section 5, Real-World Communication Applications, Theory and Practice.
This brilliantly illustrates how we actually move from theory to practice. Let's synthesize all of these concepts we've talked about, formal, informal, one-way, and two-way, into our daily lives by methodically walking through this matrix. Notice how these communication types beautifully blend depending on the setting. Let's start in the workplace. You balance official company-wide emails, which are highly formal in one way, pushing down policy to the masses, with your daily team meetings, which are formal but two-way, allowing for structured back-and-forth discussion. Yet, to truly survive and thrive in that same workplace, you also rely on peer advice and mentorship, which represents informal two-way communication. How about in education? Well, a university sends out a formal one-way examination schedule. But the true learning, the real grappling with the difficult material, happens in the informal two-way study groups that students naturally form afterward. And look at families at the bottom of the matrix. Families rely heavily on informal two-way communication. You know, those deep, meandering conversations around the dinner table to build emotional bonds and trust. However, a parent urgently telling a child, "Don't touch the hot stove," is a classic vital example of informal one-way communication. There's no time for debate there. It's an immediate directive born entirely out of love. As you can see, it all beautifully interlocks.
As we wrap up, I really want to leave you with this provocative thought. Are you relying too much on the megaphone when you should be having a conversation? Or perhaps on the flip side, are you relying too much on the informal grapevine when you really need a formally documented decision to protect your team? Finding that delicate, perfect balance between structure and spontaneity, between broadcasting and actively listening, is the true key to effective communication. Listen, if this explainer helped you view your daily interactions in a completely new light, please do me a huge favor and like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an update. Keep learning, keep communicating clearly, and I will absolutely see you in the next explainer.